Thank you all very much for coming to my talk on, as you can see, environment design as spatial cinematography. I have been asked to ask you to turn your cell phones off and to fill in the forms at the end. And yeah, so before I begin the talk properly, some quick introductions. So my name is Miriam Ballard. I am the Art Director for Visual Development at Rockstar North. I have a background in architecture and film, as well as video games. So my architecture background, I hold a first-class honours degree in architecture from Auckland University in New Zealand. So I'm a Kiwi, if you can't tell by my accent. With film, the highlight of my film career would have been as a set designer on King Kong. So that was a Peter Jackson film filmed in New Zealand. And with video games, the highlight of my video game career is most definitely my current job at Rockstar. However, I haven't just worked on big budget and AAA. When I started in the film industry, that was on low budget things, so short films, music videos, low budget TV, and low budget features. With video games, I also started out at an indie studio, and I returned to indie work in the middle of my career as well. So this talk is not just aimed at the big budget and AAA. It should be useful to anybody who's using 3D environments for their video games, no matter what your budget level. So my team, I lead a team of visual development artists. They come from a similar background. So I have on my team architects, interior designers, people from film as well, and also people from the 3D environment art. And the kind of work that we do on my team is this kind of stuff that you see here. So we do a mixture of these 3D models that you see, which internally we call previs models. So they're sketch models that are, I suppose, the first exploration of an environment. We also do reference boards, color palette passes, and some 2D artwork as well. We don't tend to work much in 2D plans. We might do an initial schematic of a space, but generally most stuff is worked out in 3D. So I think it will help for this talk if I also explain a little bit about how things are structured at Rockstar in terms of environment design, because obviously it's different at every studio. So for us, the responsibility of the first pass of an environment layout is actually the art department, not game design. So that we do it like that just because that's what suits us and that's what suits our games. You know, it's not, everybody has different needs. How my own team fits into that. So anything that is particularly difficult or problematic goes to the visual development artists. So on exteriors, that means things like there are specific issues which are a bit more tricky and maybe specific areas as well. Those will go to the visual development artists on exteriors. For interiors, every single interior gets a visual development pass. So introductions over. The main talk, environment design as spatial cinematography. What do I mean by this? So in most video games, the player is controlling the camera, not the developer. However, we can still make cinematic experiences. We just need to do this through controlling the environment rather than trying to control the camera. So to repeat that, because that's the main point of this talk, even though the player is controlling the camera, we can still create cinematic experiences. We just need to make those experiences by controlling the environment. That is quite a big question. How do we do this? And like any big question, it's best broken into smaller questions. So how do we control the 2D screen? How do we control movement? And how do we control time? Now, in film, this would obviously be done either with camera or with editing, all of these things. But again, we need to figure out how to do it with the environment. So starting with the 2D screen. So we need to compose the 3D for how it's going to look in 2D. This is the one thing that differentiates us from other media. So for painting, they're obviously painting directly on the final 2D product. For film and for cinematography, for photography and cinematography, they are obviously using the camera to control what's on screen. For us, we are composing the 3D for how it's going to look in 2D. This is one of the things that we use our previs models for. So I'm not sure if I mentioned before, the sketch models that we use as part of our initial pass, internally we call them previs models. I haven't heard anyone else use that term, but if I say previs, that's what I'm talking about. So we use our previs models to work out what we're getting on screen. We also use them to solve lots of other problems as well. I forgot to mention before that one of the goals of my department, of the visual development artists, is to make sure things work for everybody. So we are not just solving aesthetic-only problems. We are making sure that our designs are going to work for for game design, for environment art, for the art direction, for narration, for everybody. This is not aesthetics over functionality. This is aesthetics and functionality. So, as I was saying, one of the things that we use the previs for, alongside, giving game design something to test with, and environment artists something to feedback on, we also use it to compose what's on screen. So this here is the previs that we did for the lab area and the Doomsday Heist DLC. So everything I'm going to be showing you in this talk is all from GTA 5 Online DLC, just so you know. So that view was tweaked for the player. It was designed around the player view. That, by the way, is from this angle here. So we are designing around choke points and through routes because we know where the player is going to be in those situations. Now, this does mean that we can't get every single angle absolutely perfect, but this isn't that different to film either. In film, you might start a shot with something that's beautifully composed. You might end a shot with something that's beautifully composed, but not every single frame in between that is going to be a perfect composition. It's the same for us. We know where the player is going to be at certain moments and where they're going to be looking at certain moments. It doesn't matter, or it can't be helped if some angles aren't perfect. And that, again, was that view there. This, by the way, is how the previs relates to the final product. So, as you can see, when the lighting team came in, the final composition isn't exactly the same as it started in the previs, but they have had a good structure to work with. They're not trying to fix something that's not working. They've got something that they can enhance and add to. All of the screenshots I'm going to show you, by the way, and player videos are all of just real players playing the game. They are not set up by marketing or as a developer run through. It's just normal players playing normally. Okay, and this is the same environment, but just from a different angle. So this is one of the things that we're doing with our previs. So I'll explain those third markers later. But what we are doing is we are tweaking the 3D for how it looks in 2D. So we are moving around the space and we are designing by moving through it. So we'll start in Max, which is the modeling program we use, and we'll tweak so that we have good compositions on screen in Max. We'll also take it into the test bed, which is what you're seeing here. So you'll notice how a lot of the lines of the building are all lining up with those third markers. And again, not every composition is perfect. Like this angle isn't quite as good as the other ones. But again, when we swing around, it's nice again. Yeah. And again, you'll notice that the proportions of the building, even the heights between the distance from floor to ceiling, are all in proportion to those third markers. So this is how it came out in the final product. So the composition has actually been enhanced by the extra planters we added for game design. And as you can see, the composition from the previs has basically stood up. The one bit that doesn't work is where we're going right now, and that was a little bit of an oversight on my part. I didn't realize how much they were going to use these stairs. So these stairs aren't composed nicely for the 2D, but you can see that it gets nice again when we get up to the top. Okay, so that bit there was the only bit that that makes us different to other media in this respect, that we are composing the 3D for how it looks in 2D. Beyond that, when it comes to controlling the 2D screen, it is the same advice that you get for any other media. So it's the kind of advice that you would get for painting, for photography, cinematography, and so on. So one of that, So one piece of advice you get in those other media is to have nice 2D compositions. So one aspect of that is these third markers that were on the videos. So what that is there's a rule of thumb, and it is definitely a rule of thumb, not an absolute rule. There's a rule of thumb about dividing your screen up into thirds and having the main compositional weight of the image sitting on those third markers. So you'll notice how in the first image that the weight of the composition is right at the edge of the screen and not in the center. However, in the final image, I've pulled the walls in closer and the desk in closer, and the weight of the architecture, the composition of the 2D image is sitting closer to the third markers, and it's a much nicer composition, but not that much was actually changed in the model. So this is something that we're doing again as we're moving through the space. We are tweaking to get nice on-screen compositions. And again, we're not only concerned with the on-screen compositions, we're also adjusting the space for other needs as well. It's just, this is the topic of this talk. So that again was the view as you enter the space. So again, we're concerning ourselves with choke points and through routes. So another useful compositional technique is a concept of tangents, specifically avoiding tangents. So you will notice in the first image that the line of the desk is lining up with the wall behind it. So it's doing it in 2D from this very specific angle. This makes the space incredibly hard to read. It is very hard to tell in that first image how the desk relates to the wall behind it spatially. However, in the second image, I've just tweaked the desk a little bit shorter, and suddenly we can read the space much better. We can see that the desk is sitting in front of the wall. So this is what is called tangents. So that tangents are when unrelated objects are lining up on a 2D image. And again, this is something that needs to be avoided because it's hard to read the 3D space. They are very easy to fix. The tricky thing with them is actually finding them in the first place. Another thing we want to consider is the angle of the cameras that are going to be used in this space. So this here is the same space, but in different setups. So the first setup, the player is just exploring the space, and the second setup, they are in combat mode. As you can see, the camera is very different in the two scenarios. So what we want to do as much as possible is to compose the environment so that it looks good in any camera setup that's going to be used in the space. Now, it's not always possible to do this for every camera setup, obviously, but again, this is an ideal to aim for. So if you want to know more about compositions on 2D screen, this here is a particularly good book. I will also, by the way, be showing a list of all the books I reference right at the end, so don't feel like you need to write them down as I go. Also, if you don't want to buy books, there's actually a lot of advice on compositions online, so you don't need to get it, it's just a good one. One thing that book doesn't mention, however, is tangents. But if you search online for avoiding tangents in art, you will find a lot of advice on it. And for anyone who wants to delve into the science of why tangents are a problem, there's a lot of good information in that book there. So, as well as creating good compositions on screen, we also want to create depth on screen. So a screen by its nature is 2D, it's flat, which means that we need to use tips and tricks to trick the eye into seeing depth. One of the easiest techniques for doing this is creating layers. So by layers, I mean having foreground, midground, and background elements. And what happens in the scene is what you see here. The foreground elements move at a different speed across the screen to the midground and background elements. So this creates parallax animation, which is obviously what old school Disney animation uses. It's also an incredibly good way to make for very good bang for buck dynamic environments. So another way to create good depth on screen is with repeating elements. So if you have identical elements throughout the scene that are different depths in the scene, the player can use the relative sizes of those elements to judge the depth of the space. Another good way of creating depth is the use of atmospherics. So this is not part of our previs and pre-production pass, but because it has such a big effect, it felt remiss not to mention it. So for anyone who doesn't know what atmospherics are, they are when particles in the atmosphere scatter the light and they make distant objects less distinct, and you get the kind of effect that you're seeing here. So for more on depth on screen, this here is a particularly good book. So as well as creating good compositions and creating depth on screen, we also want to control the shapes that we get on screen. So we can use the shapes on screen to create an emotional experience for the player. So in terms of evolution, different shapes have different emotional effects on us. So our ancestors who liked certain shapes that in nature were associated with safe things, those ancestors were more likely to survive and have us. Our ancestors who disliked shapes in nature that were associated with dangerous things, those ancestors were more likely to survive and have us. So we have inherited the likes and dislikes of our ancestors that help them to survive. Now we can use those shapes and the emotional effect of those shapes to create an emotional experience for the player. So circular shapes in nature are associated with things which are safe and friendly. So think rolling hills, bushes, trees, that kind of thing. So they were used here in this particular one because this was something that the player was going to own, and so we wanted a nice welcoming experience for the player. So you can see that the shapes are started in the previs, but they have been very much enhanced by the environment. They've been, whoops, let's have some water. So the shapes have been very much enhanced by the interior artists who worked on it and the lighting artists as well. So jagged shapes in nature, these are dangerous things. So think broken rocks, broken sticks, broken bones, teeth, claws, that kind of thing. So we can use those shapes to create unsettling experiences for the player. So it was very appropriate for a combat space where we wanted to create a tense situation. It is exacerbated in this situation by the top-heavy nature of the architecture as well. So horizontal and vertical shapes are about power and control and stability. So a horizontal line, that's the horizon, so that's stable and unchanging. Vertical shapes, think trees and cliffs, so they are powerful things, but not necessarily as unchanging. So those shapes very much suited the storytelling of this situation where the player was playing as an office executive, and the idea was to give them a storytelling around power and control. So the shapes that end up on screen normally come from the previs, but not always. As you can see here, the curving lines on the floor are very much overriding the previs in terms of the final shapes on screen. You can also override the previs with things like, textures, patterns, and the lighting as well. So the shadows that you're getting from the lighting can make incredibly strong shapes on screen. Another thing to notice in this particular set of slides is that even though the architecture is very square in the previs, the shapes that we're getting on screen are actually very soft diagonals. The reason for this is obviously the angle that we're looking at the space from. Now, when I talked before about designing around choke points and through routes, one other thing to consider is that we actually decide where those choke points and through routes are going to be. So if we'd wanted to come into this space and make the first impression of it about power and control and stability, we would have come in front on to create square shapes on screen. If, however, we wanted a more informal introduction to the space, and something a little bit more dynamic, we can come in at a slight angle like you're seeing here. So if you want to know more about shapes on screen, this here is a particularly lovely book on the topic. So to recap, controlling the 2D screen. So we want to compose the 3D for how it's going to look in 2D, and that is the one bit that differentiates us from other media. Everything else is just the advice that you're seeing for painting, photography, and cinematography. So that's things like creating good compositions, creating depth, and creating nice shapes on screen. So, movement. How do we control movement? Unfortunately, this section is going to be quite difficult, but if you'll just bear with me for it, the last section gets easy again. The reason for this is that controlling movement, well, the camera is attached to the player, so if we want to control where the camera looks and goes, we need to control, or at least try influence, where the player looks and goes. So, saliency is going to control where the player looks, and therefore where the camera looks. Affordances will control where the player goes and therefore where the camera goes. Before I get into explaining what those terms actually mean, some quick myth busting first. So there is a concept in aesthetics that's been around for hundreds of years that a strong compositional line in a painting will lead the eye through the painting. So these are called leading lines. Now, modern science has shown that this is not actually what's happening. What is happening is that our eyes are flicking past the compositional line and they're getting caught in it like a fish in a net. There is no directional element to it. Now, if our eyes are not following those composition lines, then we are not obviously physically following them either. There's no directional aspect to this. These lines are still incredibly good for capturing the player's attention. And I also don't think we should throw out the concept of leading lines because it is very useful in terms of understanding the structure of a 2D image. However, it is an abstraction, it is a spatialization of an abstract concept. So as humans, we quite often do this. We make spatializations of abstract concepts. So for example, I might refer to somebody as being in front of me or above me. That again, those are ways of spatializing something abstract. That is all that's happening here. By talking about leading lines, we are spatializing something abstract. So it is still helpful to use, but we just need to remember that it's not literal, that their player's eyes are not literally traveling in a line, and therefore we can't lead the player with a strong compositional line. Another thing that doesn't directly lead the player in terms of direct one-to-one, although it has an influence, is lighting. So what you're looking at here is an academic study on visual attention in 3D games. Now, at this moment in the study, the players were asked to exit the space. The correct exit was behind the lit bit of wall that you see there. The players had a lot of trouble finding that exit. They tried things like doors and fireplaces in spite of the fact that they were in darkness. Now, this is because we don't automatically walk towards the light. If you think again about our evolutionary heritage, most of our evolving happened with sunlight. If you had a break in the clouds and a bit of light spilling through the clouds onto the ground, there's absolutely no reason that our ancestors should be walking towards that bit of ground. So we have not evolved to work in that way. What light can do, however, is it can help us see things that we might not otherwise see, and it can give spatial information that we might not otherwise have. So it is still very useful in leading the player, but it's just not a direct one-to-one. So something else, and this here I just want to give a bit of nuance on this one. So there is a concept called weenies, which a lot of you will be familiar with. And because every time I've given a test of this talk, people have asked me to spell it out, that's W-E-E-N-I-E-S. It is the German word for sausage. So the term was coined by Walt Disney, and the idea is that a weenie leads the guest in the same way that a sausage leads a dog. Weenies absolutely work, there's no doubt about it, but the reason they work is because of the mystery element. So weenies have two aspects to them. They are a landmark and they have mystery. A landmark by itself is incredibly useful and incredibly important in terms of the wayfinding for the player, but if you want to actually lead the player to the landmark, you need to add mystery. I'm going to be talking about mystery later, so we will come back to this one. So, myth busting over, how do we lead the player and therefore lead the camera? So saliency will control where the player looks and therefore where the camera looks. Affordances will control where the player goes and therefore where the camera goes. So that's starting with saliency. So saliency is a scientific term which means attention. So something that is highly salient is something that is attention grabbing. There are two types of saliency. We have bottom up and top down. So bottom up saliency is all about contrast. So it's contrast of color, it's contrast of size, contrast of shape, contrast of orientation, contrast of texture, and that's the bottom left-hand corner, that one's a bit more subtle, and contrast of movement. Top-down saliency, on the other hand, is about things which are meaningful. So human faces are always highly salient to us because they are meaningful to us. Humans in general are always highly salient because, again, they are meaningful. Things which are associated with a current task or goal. So if I am playing a ball game, then a ball shape is going to be very salient to me. If I'm getting ready for work, then shoe shapes will be salient. If I'm thirsty, then shapes associated with drinks will be salient. And of course, there are some things which are always salient to us because they affect things like safety. So the final saliency, so where our attention is going, is a mix of both bottom up and top down. How much comes from bottom up and how much comes from top down depends on what mode that we're in. So the more we are in a task-orientated or goal-orientated mode, the more top-down saliency is dominating. Now, this is quite important for video games because obviously our players are usually in a very task-orientated or goal-orientated mode. This means that compared to other media, the top-down saliency is going to be much stronger. So in film, where people are just sitting there and watching a film, the bottom-up saliency will be stronger because people are just in a relaxed mode. For our games, the top-down saliency will be stronger. So what you're looking at right here, this is an eye-tracking heat map that was done for an architectural study. So they were comparing two photoshopped versions of the same image. Now, an eye-tracking heat map, for our intents and purposes, is identical to a saliency map. Where people are looking is where their attention is. Now, this is not where they are consciously looking. This is where their eyes are subconsciously flicking to. Now, what is interesting here is that the people looking at these images would not have been in very task-orientated or goal-orientated modes. They were just asked to look at a picture. However, the top-down saliency is incredibly strong. If you look at the image at the eaves on the top of the image, try to get that one as well, and see where they're contrasted against the sky in the background, that is the strongest bit of contrast in the image. So if this was about bottom-up saliency, everybody should be looking at the eaves of the building. But nobody's looking at the eaves of the building. They're looking at windows and doors and the signs above the door. That is because these things are meaningful. So with a window, we can see through it. It's also associated with people. The same, and doors as well are associated with people, and the sign with information. Okay, so if you want to know more about saliency and attention, unfortunately, I don't have any easy reference with this one. So this here is a lecture which I'm pretty sure was aimed at first-year neuroscience students. So if you're anything like me, you will not recognize a lot of the terms in the video, but a few listen-throughs, you do start to pick things up. And this is a similar one as well. Again, I'm pretty sure it's a first-year lecture aimed at neuroscience students. And this was the academic study I mentioned on visual attention and video games. I've not seen very much on this topic. I mean, it might be out there, I might have just missed it, but this is all I've personally found. So if saliency or attention is controlling where the player and therefore the camera looks, affordances are controlling where the player and therefore the camera goes. So for anybody who doesn't know what affordances are, a quick recap. So affordances are the action that an object allows. So a chair affords sitting, a car affords driving, a door affords opening, floor affords walking, window affords looking through. You get the idea. Now, there is such a thing as misperceived affordances. This is when something looks like it does something, but it actually doesn't. So you might have a chair in your video game that looks like it affords sitting, but you can't sit in it. And so obviously in video games, this happens quite a lot because we pull shapes from the real world, but we don't copy all the affordances of the real world. So one solution to this is what are called signifiers. So signifiers are arbitrary signals that the player needs to learn that communicate affordances. So a traffic light in the real world affords the fact that you can go. In video games, we often use yellow lines and things like and strong colors to highlight things which are interactable. And signs and symbols are, of course, signifiers as well. Now, one thing to be aware of with signifiers is that they do, to a certain extent, break the fourth wall because it means we are talking directly to the player. Now, this suits some games and not others. This is entirely context dependent, but it is something to be aware of. And there is quite a bit online about video games and affordances, so these are good places to start. And that there was the original book on the topic. This was for product design, not games, but the same principles apply. So recap over, how do affordances lead the player? So we're going to start with the simplest type of affordances, because there are many types. You will see that the player is walking straight to the vending machine. It's pretty simple. So this is object affordances, and the player will simply move towards an object to use it. It really is that simple. Now, it doesn't just have to be something that's a very real world affordance like this. It can also be affordances like a plank affords walking, a rope affords climbing, a window affords climbing through, a fence affords breaking. These are things which the player will move towards. If it is the only affordance in the scene as well, then the player is definitely very likely to use it, to go there. But of course, we need to make sure that we communicate that affordance to the player and that the player can see it and understand it. So, as well as simple object affordances, we also have surface affordances. So when I mentioned to you before that a floor affords walking, this is a surface affordance. This is also something that people will walk towards, just like the object. So what you're looking at here, this is two different academic studies. The one on your right, the white one, that was a real-world study of the Tate Gallery where they were tracking human movement through the Tate Gallery. The study on your left, on the black image, that was a digital recreation of that study. So what the people were trying to do in the digital recreation is they were trying to prove this idea that surface affordances attract people, that we walk towards a walkable surface. So what they did is they set up some very simple rules for the bots in the study. Those bots were told that every so often they would stop and change direction. The direction they were most likely to walk towards was the longest sight line. Now, in the context of this study and the Tate Gallery, a long sight line correlates with a larger walkable surface area, or the greater affordance of a walkable surface area. So, if you look closely at the at the bits where they're walking in the center. So you'll notice that the shapes made by the real humans and the shapes made by the bots are very similar. Neither of them are walking right at the edge of the space, and we're also not getting a very narrow channel down the center. We're getting very similar shape of movement. This shows that we as humans do walk towards a walkable surface area that the bots did, that the rules the bots had did correlate with human movement. So it is worth remembering that in the context of this Tate Gallery study that there was not much else going on in terms of affordances. Obviously, most real environments have more types of affordances which would complicate this. So, as well as object affordances and surface affordances, we also have complex affordances. And again, these are attracting the player. We're concerned with these attracting the player because the camera is attached to the player. Yes, so as I was saying, so we have complex affordances here. So I sent out a tweet with this particular view, asking people, if this was a video game, where would you go? I had just been reading the Tate Gallery study at the time, so in my head, everyone was going off to the right towards the greatest walkable surface affordance. The responses I got are, I'm sure, what every single one of you are thinking right now. If this is a video game, I'm going up the alleyway to the side. Yes. So after a bit of rethinking and recalibrating on that one, what I eventually figured out was what is going on here is that we have created a complex affordance that we have taught the player. The signifier of this is a small alleyway or a side path, and the affordance is some kind of gameplay reward. So that might be a treasure chest, or it might be a way to flank enemies, or some new areas to discover. So yes, in a video game, the greatest affordance with this is the small alleyway or side path, so people are going in that direction. In real life, it is still the road to the right, because we don't have treasure chests in real life. So, it's a shame. So as well as object affordances, surface affordances, and complex affordances, we also have spatial affordances. So there is a concept in architecture called prospect and refuge. Prospect is a view and refuge is safety. So this particular image, I would describe it as being very strong prospect, but maybe medium refuge. So this here, this is also prospect and refuge. The prospect isn't quite as strong. There is a view, but it's not as epic as the previous one. But the refuge is much stronger. This space feels much safer and much more protected. This is also both prospect and refuge, but from where we are further back a bit, the prospect is quite low. There's not that much we can see, but the refuge is incredibly strong. Obviously, for the soldier who is right in the window, they have both very strong prospect and very strong refuge. Okay, so there are two types of prospect and refuge in the architectural literature. There is primary prospect and refuge and secondary prospect and refuge. So this here is secondary prospect and refuge. And I'm just going to jump back some slides because I shouldn't have moved quite yet. These here are all primary prospect and refuge. So primary prospect and refuge is when we have a view where we are right now and we have safety where we are right now. So these are all primary prospect and refuge. Secondary prospect and refuge is when we can see a spot in front of us that would afford prospect or afford refuge, but we don't have it right now. So we know that if we went up to that castle, we would have a view from that castle and we would have safety in that castle. That is secondary prospect and refuge. As humans, we like prospect and refuge, and so this is something that we will walk towards. Now this, by the way, is again about our evolutionary heritage. The reason we like prospect and refuge is because this kept our ancestors safe. The ancestors who liked prospect spaces and refuge spaces were the ancestors who were more likely to survive and have us. So this has a very interesting effect on the movement in a space. So you can see this particular interior here. There is very weak, or there's no primary prospect and refuge, but there is a lot of very small implied secondary prospect and refuge. The player is constantly being promised there might be a view around the corner, maybe the next pillar is going to offer safety. What this does is make the player move. So again, we're concerned with the player moving because the camera is attached to our player, so you will get a lot of very fast, fluid movement through the space. This is in contrast to very strong primary prospect and refuge. So here we have a very strong view and a very strong safety. And please ignore that plant, by the way. This was the best example I could find. I just wish I didn't have the plant. But yeah, you can see that they're not moving. Like they have very strong primary prospect and refuge. There is no promise of secondary prospect or refuge anywhere. There's nowhere that it looks like you would have a better view if you moved there, and nowhere that it looks like you would have better safety if you moved there. So the player is just not moving. And when they do eventually move like they have now, they're moving slower. Now this is neither good nor bad. This is simply about controlling the type of player movement and therefore camera movement that you're after. Another thing to be aware of between the two is actually the amount of walkable surface area in view. In this one here, where we have the much faster, more fluid camera movement, we have a lot more walkable surface area in view, as compared to this one here, where there is very little walkable surface area in view. So the difference between the movement in these two spaces is both the prospect and refuge, as well as the walkable surface area. So if you want to know more about Prospect and Refuge, this here is the book to go to. Now this is an architecture book, and as I said before, this is about our evolutionary heritage. So this is not just tactics for shooter games, and this is how we have evolved. So these principles can be used in non-violent games, and they can also be used in non-violent moments of action games. So as we talked about before, mystery also attracts the player. How this is working in terms of affordances is that the affordance is that there is information for us to learn. As humans, we very much like learning information. So what is going on here is that the castle in this case is promising us that if we move closer, there will be more for us to learn. Now, how it is doing it in this particular situation is with the very interesting profile and with the extra detail on the architecture that tells us that there is stuff to discover if we get closer. The secondary prospect that I was talking about before, that is also about mystery. If we move closer to that spot, we will get a view, and of course a view is information. So, as well as simple object affordances, surface affordances, complex affordances, and spatial affordances, we also have wayfinding elements. So a quick recap here for anyone who doesn't know. So there are 5 types of wayfinding elements. We have landmarks. These are individual objects which stand out. So think a church spire or a mountain. We have districts. Districts are areas with their own flavour, so think Chinatown, the Wharf, Central Business District, that kind of thing. Linear elements are, are linear elements which afford movement. So think a path, obviously, but also a road. If you're in a boat, then a river would be a path. If you're in a car, then a motorway. So edges are linear elements which prevent movement. So think of a wharf. Also think again of the river, but this time if you're traveling in a car. And think again of a motorway, but this time if you're traveling on foot. So these are very context dependent in terms of how you're traveling. And then we have nodes. Nodes are moments of decision or choice. So think of an intersection, a town square, but also think of things like an airport or a train station. So as I mentioned before, wayfinding elements don't directly lead the player, but they do affect the mental map that players have, and that mental map affects where the players will go. So to give you an example, if you were to give someone directions somewhere pre-Google Map days, you might say something like this. Follow this road till you get to the tree. At the tree, turn left. Once you cross the river, it's the red door on your right. There, I just used wayfinding elements. So the road that we were on was a path, the tree was a landmark, the river that we crossed was an edge, and the red door was another landmark at a different scale. So what we're doing is we are structuring our understanding of a space around these different elements. And it is our understanding of a space that will affect how we move through a space. Now this is absolutely something that could easily be a whole talk in its own right, so I'm going to leave it there. But if you want to know more about wayfinding elements, this here is the book that those originally come from. And there's quite a lot of interesting modern science on how we do spatial mapping. So there is a particularly good article. There was also a talk on Monday, which unfortunately you've missed if you didn't go to it, but I'm sure it'll be on the vault. But yeah, that was also a good talk on spatial mapping. So to recap the movement section, so saliency or attention will control where the player looks and therefore where the camera looks. We had 2 types of saliency. We had bottom up and we had top down. And again, the top down saliency is stronger when people are in a task orientated or goal orientated mode. Affordances are controlling where the player goes and therefore where the camera goes. So we had simple object affordances, surface affordances, complex affordances, spatial affordances, and wayfinding elements. So moving on to the final section now, time. So time in film would normally be controlled with the camera or with editing. For us, we obviously aren't directly controlling the camera apart from what guidance we can give the player, and we don't have editing outside of cutscenes. Luckily for us, space is experienced over time. So when I take in this room, I don't take it all in one instant, in one moment. I take it in because my eye is traveling over it, or I'm physically walking through it, or in a video game, my avatar might be walking through it. This means that what is laid out over space is actually experienced over time. So we can set things up in space that we want to be experienced over time. One major element of this is repetition and rhythm. So in film, they would often do editing to get different types of rhythm. So you might have much faster editing to create an intense moment in the film. So we can set up rhythm with architectural repetition. So repeating elements architecturally will be experienced as a rhythm over time. So if you look at these columns here, you don't, again, take them in all in one instant, in one moment. You take them in over time as your eye travels over them. We can change the layout of that rhythm, of the architecture, to change the type of rhythm we're getting. Now that is easiest explained on a little mock-up. So you can see that the columns on the left are much closer together than the columns on the right and create a much more intense rhythm than the columns on the right. So we can change the density over space to affect the intensity over time. So for more on the architectural side of this here is a particularly good book. Now, as with anything that involves intensity, this is something that we want to change over time. So to be constantly at high intensity can get a little bit overwhelming for the player, and they can also become numb to it. And to be at a low intensity constantly can become a bit boring. So we want to change things up. And again, changing things up in terms of intensity over time means changing things up in terms of density over space. So we don't want to have the same kind of layouts and patterns throughout our spaces. We want to vary them. So, as well as rhythm and repetition, we also want to think about transitions. So in film, this would be how you go from one shot to the next. So that might be a cut, or it might be a dissolve, or a few other things as well, but those are the main ones. So again, for us, what is happening over space is experienced over time, so we can do this through our spatial layouts. So the classic example here would be Disneyland. So what they do when you go between spaces in Disneyland is they create stylistic transitions. So what you're looking at, the red arrows are elements of one style. It is a little bit hard to see, I'm afraid, but you can always go to Disneyland, see it? Yeah. So the red elements are, the red arrows are pointing to elements of one style, the yellow to elements of the other style. So they're things like lampposts and handrails and stuff like that it's pointing to. And the orange one doesn't fit either. As you can see, there isn't an abrupt transition. They slowly stop one and introduce another. So there are moments right in the middle there where you actually get lampposts of one style that are sitting over the top of handrails of another style. So they are creating stylistic dissolves between area, and again, they're laying them out over space, but they are experienced over time. So we can do this architecturally as well. So what you're looking at here, so this was done for the After Hours DLC. So these two very different architectural styles that you're looking at, pardon me, they were supposed to belong to the same space. So the first one, the reason we used the post and beam industrial style architecture was because this was supposed to be a club, and this was the kind of spaces that you saw in those types of clubs. However, the final one with the curving architectural style, sorry, I need some water here. Yeah. So the final one, so this curving architectural style, the reason for that was that it was a storage space, and it would just be incredibly boring to have a post and beam architectural style for a storage space. And we try very much not to do boring. So What the architect who worked on this, what she did was she created a transitional area between the two. So the office area, which sat between these two spaces, she had both elements from both styles. So there were the curves and there were the post and beam elements. And now suddenly the spaces actually feel like they belong together. So for more on different types of ways you can transition architecturally, this here is the book to go to. This is definitely a book to dip into rather than to try read cover to cover. Luckily for us with architecture, we actually have a lot more options here compared to film. To give you another example, if you were to say walk into a building straight off the street, so there's just a door directly on the street, that would be the equivalent of a cut. If you added some elements like a veranda or similar between the door and the street, you would create more of a dissolve. There are a lot, and I do mean a lot, of different ways we can move between spaces architecturally. And yes, that's the book to go to. So to recap the whole talk now. So we were looking at the fact that even though we can't control the camera, we can control the environment that the player moves through. This means that we can create cinematic experiences by controlling the environment. So with the 2D screen, we are composing the 3D for how it looks in 2D. That was the main thing that was, thank you. That was the main thing that was differentiating us from other media. And beyond that, everything else was just the normal advice that you get in other media. So it was creating good compositions, it was creating depth, and it was creating nice shapes on screen. With the movement section, that was about saliency and affordances. So saliency is controlling where the player is looking and therefore where the camera is looking. And we had bottom-up saliency and top-down saliency. Affordances are controlling where the player is going and therefore where the camera is going. And for that, we had object affordances, surface affordances, spatial affordances, and wayfinding elements. With time, space is experienced over time, so we can set up spatially what we want to be experienced over time. So this was rhythm and repetition was one of the main elements, but also controlling our transitions. So this is the end of the talk, and that's the promised list of references. Oh. And we've got about 8 minutes. Questions?
Thank you. Excellent talk.
Sorry?
I have a question. Like, if you apply the same principles to something like VR,
to what? Sorry?
like a virtual reality, so would you just throw away the 2D screen?
Yeah, I think everything else would work, but definitely the stuff on the 2D screen wouldn't be as relevant. Oh, sorry. So would this apply to virtual reality as well? So most of it would apply, just not the 2D screen section. Yeah. Any other questions? Nope.
Sorry.
Okay.
Just tripping over everything. Yes, wonderful talk. I was just curious about choke points as we were beginning, and I was trying to think of other examples aside from tight hallways. And then I saw that last slide of yours about transitions, and I was curious, is it possible to have a sort of overlap in that? Can contrasts between rooms and transitions between those rooms, could that also be considered a choke point?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. A choke point, would... how do I describe that question? So is there an overlap between the transitions between spaces and choke points?
Yeah.
Yeah. So absolutely. So a choke point is simply a spot where you know the player is going to be, and so transitions can help you know where that spot will be. You can also do it with props and stuff as well. It doesn't just need to be architecture. Did that answer the question?
Yes, very well. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
First, great talk. So my question is, the footage you showed, are gathered from artistic meetings or carried out by QA teams?
That was just so the question was the footage I showed, where is it from? That's just normal players playing the game. So it's not QA, yeah.
And how are those used for evaluation, and how do you evaluate whether it's effective or not?
Sorry, can you repeat?
How do you evaluate the effectiveness of the conversation based on the footage you gathered?
So what, I think, so how do we evaluate the footage? Is that the basic question? So,
yeah, my question is kind of how do you integrate this into the pipeline and based on different iteration?
So how do we integrate this into the pipeline? So this is often about analysing what we've done in the previous pack and trying to take lessons from it and then incorporate that in the next design. So it's very much a learning process. Sometimes if there's stuff that we're seeing, say in the playtest footage from the game design that we notice something off, we might be able to change it in the current pack, but normally it's about learning from past experience and applying it next time.
Thank you much.
Okay, thank you. Cool. Anything else, or are we done? Cool. Oh, thank you all very much for coming. Oh, okay.
How do you deal with the designer side of it, working with
Okay.
your space and then stuff with
Yeah.
design?
So the question was, how do we deal with the designer? How do we deal with the designer side of it? Yeah. We talk to them a lot. So, yeah, it's as simple as that. So the briefs that we'll get can be anything from something as simple as this needs to be a place where the player defends to a very detailed list of everything they want. So we will, when it's a brief, we might flesh it out and take it back to them. And so when we feel like we've got a brief we can work off, and we'll communicate that brief to them. And we'll normally communicate as well, like initial design ideas, like I'll show them reference, this is the kind of space that I think of doing. Will that work for you? And they'll say yes or no. And then, yeah, we show them as we work. Like we show them more when it's something difficult or complicated. If it's straightforward, we might just do it. But yeah, and then when they get it, they're play testing it and they're asking for any changes they need. So it's, yeah, it works. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Would you have some advice for more open world? I'm thinking about, for example, Red Dead Redemption, where at choke points sometimes when the player has a lot of opportunity to wander around in the wilderness and to come up in a location from any direction, do you have some, I don't know, advice or a way to read the environment or to analyze it in a way that we can apply this?
Yeah, so the question was if we have any advice for open world games where the player might be moving in any direction and coming from any direction. So what I was talking before about the wayfinding elements, so if there is a path in the scene, the player is more likely to be following that path, even if it just is, say, the vegetation being less distinct in that particular area. It might be an animal path. So we're more likely to walk in those kind of routes. So you can just walk around the space and see it. And you can also, again, see play tests to see where people are actually moving. But yeah, it really is just about experimenting, taking stuff into the test bed. Where does it feel natural to move? How do things look when you move that way? Did that answer your question?
Yes. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Any more, or are we done? Cool. Oh, thank you all very much for coming. Cool. Yeah.